Hi, everyone. So, as Chris mentioned, my name is Chloe, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Joyce, Sarai, Theodora, and Jamil. And we'll be presenting on promoting newcomer labor integration through decent work in the nonprofit sector. So, before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge the traditional land upon which we gather today. This policy lab was developed at the Max Bell School on the McGill University campus located in Gahaga. This land has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples who presence marks this territory on which people of the world now gather. So for the content of our presentation, we'll first begin discussing the issue, scope, and key definition, then go into the context and 3 key findings before we present our 2 policy recommendations, conclude, and break for questions. So last year alone, 472,000 new permanent residents made Canada their home. This number is only set to rise with Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC, announcing an unprecedented target of 500,000 new permanent residents in 2025. 82% of these will be coming through economic streams. Now, immigration policy has long prioritized this stream because these newcomers make valuable and necessary contributions to the Canadian economy. In fact, newcomers account for 100% of the labor force growth in Canada. But upon arrival, they face many challenges integrating into the country. What's more is that the same government that facilitates their entry into Canada does not directly provide them with settlement services. Instead, it relies on the nonprofit sector to deliver these settlement services through the RCC settlement program. In recent years, the nonprofit sector services has seen an increase in demand, especially for smaller organizations. For example, in 2023, community-based organizations reported a 47% increase in the demand for their services, while their capacity had only increased by 14%. So in light of all of this, Imagine Canada posed the following question. What are the key factors driving newcomers to Canada to seek employment in the nonprofit sector, and how can the sector best support their integration into the country? So when we were trying to scope and understand this question, we had to define 3 key terms. First, who is a newcomer? This is a very broad term, and it encompasses many different groups. Although it refers to people who have recently arrived in Canada, these people can hold various legal statuses, including international students, temporary foreign workers, economic migrants, and refugees. And variation can even exist within and between these groups, as they come with different levels of education, types of educations, skills, and even the level of financial standing that they arrive with. But due to RCC's focus on economic migrants, a newcomer in our scope refers to a permanent resident holder who has been in the country for 5 years or less. In the same way, the nonprofit sector is also very broad in the country. It encompasses organizations like big philanthropic foundations, schools, and even hospitals. But in our scope, the nonprofit sector refers to community-based organizations, or CBOs, whose biggest funder is the government, whether on a federal, provincial, or municipal level. The last term we need to define and understand is integration. Now, this is a very ambiguous term, and it's important to recognize that true or successful integration is highly subjective or dependent on each individual. But at the most basic level and for our scope, integration is referring to the unrestricted access into the labor market and to the provision of decent work. Decent work is a central framework in our policy challenge. It is depicted by the International Labour Organization as fair income, security in the workplace, better prospects for professional development, and social integration. It also means that people are getting work that matches their skills, interests, and experiences. So access to the labor market and decent work are important steps to fuller and more comprehensive integration. So moving on to our research, the first key finding that we landed on was that the Canadian labor market is not accessible enough to newcomers, and this is due to 2 types of barriers. The first, more direct barrier, is referring to the process of credentialing or getting foreign education or work experience recognized. Newcomers are more likely than the Canadian-born population to have a university-level education. But still, a gap of 11% remains between these two groups' employment rates. Our stakeholders have also mentioned that employers lack the internal policies and capacities to adequately assess the value of credentials and experiences and skills. And despite efforts to improve this process, newcomers still face long wait times to get their credentials validated, if at all. So this leads to an education-occupation mismatch, where newcomers are pushed to accept work that is below their work experience, their professional aspirations, and their skill levels. So this is especially true for immigrants from developing countries, and that's a perfect segue into our second, systemic barriers. Our review of the literature has shown that clear discrimination and bias exist when hiring newcomers. For example, 90% of newcomers speak English or French upon arrival to Canada. But still, their accents or a perception of poor languages causes hindrances to their labor market opportunities. To illustrate this further, people with English names are 45% more likely to land a job than people with Chinese or Indian names. Specifically, newcomer women are further marginalized, and this is due to the gender wage gap, their perceived fit for unpaid, unskilled care work, and a lack of affordable access to childcare. This takes us to our second systemic barrier, which is the effect of gaps in social support and public services. We will discuss public transport and childcare to illustrate the importance of supporting infrastructure in getting labor market access. Newcomers rely more than the Canadian-born population on public transport to find and keep employment. But in Canada, public transport is burdened by long commute times, long distances, high costs, and poor connections. And this effect is especially more pronounced for newcomers who end up in rural communities. Second, the literature also shows that access to childcare enables full economic participation for women. But high costs of childcare in the country and the lack of spaces for childcare prevent women from accessing many opportunities. So these are the barriers that are pushing newcomers away from the broader labor market, and I'll pass it on to Theodora to discuss our second and third key findings.
Thank you, Chloe. While newcomers are pushed out of the broader labor market, the nonprofit sector emerges as a space for opportunity for newcomers because of several pull factors that I will outline now. The first is a negative pull factor, highlighted in red, which is the negative perceptions of the nonprofit sector. The sector is often perceived as volunteer, unpaid, or unskilled work. For this reason, this creates vacancies that newcomers can then fill. Care work is also gendered. Women make up 70% of the sector, and the perception of care work as women's work has led to it being undervalued and underpaid. Newcomers also have social networks with ties to the sector. Our research has shown that newcomers find work in the sectors that serve them. About a quarter of people that work in CBOs are immigrants, and newcomers can leverage their connections to the sector to find employment. Nonprofit organizations also have flexible hiring practices. Our stakeholders have told us that they value the soft skills, cultural sensitivity, and diverse backgrounds that newcomers bring to the sector. Organizations have been flexible by altering job titles or offering work on a part-time, contract, or project-based basis. Because of these factors, newcomers are pulled into the nonprofit sector. The sector itself is essential for delivering service gaps in housing, healthcare, and education. CBOs in particular contribute 2% of GDP and employ over 600,000 people. 25% of the people that they employ are immigrants, and 30% are visible minorities. Despite the sector's economic and social importance, the nonprofit sector does not have the capacity to provide decent work to newcomers that they need to integrate into Canada. I will now discuss the nonprofit funding model. This funding model is not sustainable. 40% of nonprofit funding comes from government, which makes government funding essential for maintaining operations. This funding ecosystem creates two key challenges. The first is that funding is insufficient. Limited funding not only means less capacity to provide decent work and to deliver services, but it also means fierce competition between organizations for funding, while the need for collaboration and integrated services is rising. Funding is also restrictive and project-based. The nonprofit sector is told how to allocate their funds, rather than having the flexibility to allocate money where it is needed the most. Nonprofits also deal with burdensome reporting and evaluation requirements. These restrictions create more work and reduce the ability of nonprofits to adjust to evolving needs. Some organizations have even had to refuse grants because they cannot afford the organizational costs that they come with. Without autonomy, nonprofits are pressured to decreasing spending on core functions, which reduces their sustainability and their longevity over time. These funding challenges have caused a human resources crisis in the sector. Turnover is inevitable because of the limited benefits, the inadequate professional development opportunities, and poor pay, all of which are the result of funding challenges within the sector. At least a quarter of organizations have reported turnover rates of 21 to over 80%. The failure to integrate newcomers into Canada also has important economic and social costs. When newcomers are unemployed or underemployed, meaning they are working in jobs that fail to leverage their skills, this decreases overall productivity and economic growth in Canada. Underutilizing skills costs $5 billion a year to the Canadian economy, and if we were to adequately recognize their qualifications, we would add an estimated $13 to $17 billion a year to the Canadian economy. Work precarity also makes newcomers even more financially and socially vulnerable. This makes them more susceptible to labor trafficking and exploitation because they might be willing to accept substandard working conditions out of desperation. When newcomers struggle to afford essential needs, this ultimately impacts their overall individual happiness, social belonging, and mental well-being. This is an issue that everyone should care about because the costs to newcomers trickle down into the communities around them and affect social cohesion in Canada. The lack of accessible opportunities and the funding challenges in the nonprofit sector leave newcomers in a space of precarity, both economically and socially. Part of the solution is to shift to effective funding mechanisms that enhance organizational performance and sustainability. Unrestricted and sustainable funding has precedent. The Mackenzie Scott Foundation, for example, has distributed over $14 billion in unrestricted funding to nonprofit organizations, which they have then used to improve capacity, service delivery, and employ equitable hiring initiatives. I will now pass it to my colleague Sadie to introduce our first recommendation.
Thank you, Theodora. So for our first recommendation, we propose the creation of a job matching program that aims to connect newcomers to roles in the nonprofit sector. We call it the Newcomer Nonprofit Pathways Program, or NNP program. We propose the NNP program to facilitate the employment of 6,000 newcomers in community-based organizations, and the first phase is intended to last for a period of 5 years. The roles that will be created by community-based organizations across Canada will last between 1 and 2 years in order to be significant work experiences for newcomers. The program, as it relates to employment, should be delivered by Employment and Social Development Canada, or ESDC, in collaboration with IRCC. The key component of the NNP program is a wage subsidy. This wage subsidy will cover up to 100% of the newcomer's annual wage. So, what are the objectives of this program? The short-term objective of the program is to provide temporary decent work opportunities for eligible newcomers, while also increasing the funding capacity of CBOs to have highly skilled newcomers contributing to their organizations. And the medium and long-term goal is to facilitate the labor market integration process of newcomers by providing them with a direct pathway to their first Canadian job experience. To craft this recommendation, we use 2 existing federal government programs as references. The first one is the Federal Internship for Newcomers, also known as the FIN program. This program is delivered by IRCC and allows newcomers to gain temporary job experiences within the federal, provincial, and municipal governments for up to 90 days. The second is the Canada Summer Jobs program. This program is delivered by ESDC and targets youth, as it is another segment of the population that also faces relevant challenges to enter the Canadian labor market. In this specific case, ESDC provides a wage subsidy to eligible roles and participants working in private and nonprofit organizations for a maximum of 4 months. These case studies define part of the features that we suggested for the NNP program. Others were intentionally modified to address some of the issues we found in our research and during our stakeholder consultation process. In terms of the eligibility criteria, first, small community-based organizations should be prioritized to receive the wage subsidy, as they are the ones that are struggling the most in the nonprofit sector, just as Theodora pointed out earlier. Second, eligible community-based organizations should create positions that are full-time, roles that go from entry to senior level positions, and a role that clearly outlines a growth opportunity for the newcomer. This will recognize the different skills, experiences, and education newcomers bring to Canada, while also allows them to gain Canadian work experience and develop skills that will ultimately enhance their employability when they try to enter into the broader labor market in the future. And finally, newcomers. As Chloe mentioned earlier, eligible newcomers are those who are permanent residents with up to 5 years in Canada. Some of the most vulnerable groups should be prioritized, such as visible minorities and women. Moving on to the overall benefits, the Newcomer Nonprofit Pathway Program would provide newcomers with their first work experience in Canada with decent work, and it will also facilitate their integration process within the first 5 years of arrival. For the nonprofits, some of the benefits of this program is that it increases their organizational capacity at no additional cost, and organizations will keep harnessing everything newcomers bring to the table. Moving on to next steps and the implementation plan. First, we envision Imagine Canada leading the process of advocating for the NMPP program to be created by ESDC. Step 2, ESDC, in collaboration with IRCC, designs and launches the NMP program. Next, CBOs create roles and apply to obtain the wage subsidy. Then, after ESDC has approved, CBOs conduct and finalize the hiring process. Finally, ESDC provides CBOs with the wage subsidy once the newcomer starts working in the organization. Moving on to the cost, so we estimated that the cost of the program is approximately $688 million for the initial phase of 5 years, covering the wages of 6,000 newcomers. This cost was based on a target salary of $80,000 per year. However, the wage would be adjusted by the position, the cost of living, and inflation rate. So these were the most relevant aspects of recommendation number 1, and now I'll hand it over to Jamil, who will explain our second recommendation.
Thank you, Sarahi. What we want to highlight in our recommendations is that at the core of our recommendation is building the capacity of the nonprofits, ensuring their long-term sustainability. The current reality is that many nonprofit organizations, especially community-based organizations, are unable to provide decent work to their employees and focus on their mandates. This is why we are proposing the development of a charter for fair and sustainable funding practices. This recommendation calls for Imagine Canada to advocate to the federal government to set out key principles and guidelines for government funders to follow in order to support the long-term sustainability of nonprofit organizations. In 1998, the government launched the Voluntary Sector Initiative aimed at strengthening the relationship between government and the nonprofit sector. The primary goal of this initiative is to enhance the capacity of the nonprofit sector to provide social services and community services to the people they serve. Key components of this initiative include the development of a joint table for policy development and a national accord outlining principles and commitments for mutual benefit. However, this initiative faced several challenges. By the year 2000, this initiative was abruptly cancelled due to funding constraints and shifting priorities. This cancellation highlights the importance of why there needs to be a permanent solution to the relationship between government and the nonprofit sector. By establishing a framework based on principles of transparency, accountability, and adaptability, and funding that is tailored to the unique needs of each organization, the nonprofit sector will be well positioned to provide the needed services in the community. Through the establishment of a legislative framework, we are hoping that this recommendation would provide a legally protected principle and guideline that will ensure stable and predictable funding environment for the nonprofit sector. Additionally, The charter would ensure that there are flexible yet accountable guidelines and the establishment of a federal nonprofit advocate, which is akin to the federal housing advocate. The role of the nonprofit advocate would be to lead the charge for the development and implementation of this charter. Additionally, the advocate would lead the charge for stakeholder engagement, engaging community-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, and other government departments from the federal, provincial, to the municipal level to ensure that the development of this charter is inclusive and reflects the unique needs and challenges of the nonprofits in Canada. In addition, the advocate would track the progress of the implementation of this charter and also report to the Minister and Parliament. We are envisaging that the legislative framework within this charter would ensure that the authority and independence of the advocate is protected. I now move on to some of the proposed guidelines we are proposing to be in the charter. These are not cast in stone, but then it will change depending on the consultation and what the needs of the nonprofit are. These are developed from our stakeholder engagement and our literature review. The first guideline is fair funding agreements. Like my colleagues mentioned, nonprofits spend significant amount of resources to comply to the administrative requirements to secure and maintain funding. This does not only take resources away from them, but it does not allow them to provide decent work to their employees. Streamlining this process would ensure that nonprofits reduce the administrative burden that comes with securing funding, and most importantly, free up resources for them to provide decent work to their employees. Number 2 is the length of contract. This guideline is proposing a minimum of 5 years contract between government funders and the nonprofits. This would allow them to plan and execute their mandates effectively. Number 3 is flexibility and trust. We are asking government funders to trust the capacity of nonprofits to understand and appreciate the needs of the communities they serve, allowing them to channel resources where they are most needed, rather than providing strict resources that are mostly conditional and do not get the results needed. And number 4 is capacity building support. This is a very critical component of this guideline, because through our stakeholder engagement and engagement with through our stakeholder engagement, one thing keeps recurring, and it is that nonprofits are unable to cover operational costs and overhead costs. So we are proposing that any type of funding from government should ensure that operational and overhead costs is being covered. Currently, the percent is very low, but it could be increased to ensure that the nonprofit's capacity is built to be able to provide effective services to the communities they serve. I would hand over to my colleague to speak to the other 4 guidelines and the implementation plan for this recommendation.
Thank you, Jamil. Our 5th proposed guideline relates to collaborative relationships. Fostering a good relationship and partnership between funders and nonprofits characterized by mutual respect, open communication, and a shared commitment to achieving positive social outcomes yields better results for nonprofits. The next proposed guideline relates to supporting vulnerable groups. Ensuring funding practices that support CBOs employing and serving vulnerable groups, especially racialized newcomers, promotes inclusivity and equity. Funding criteria should explicitly support these groups with fair and accessible application processes. The next proposed guideline relates to reducing competition for funds. Creating funding mechanisms such as pooled funding and collaborative grants fosters a cooperative ecosystem that reduces fund competition among nonprofits. And our last proposed guideline relates to accountability and learning. This emphasizes the importance of continuous learning with funders and nonprofits working together to evaluate outcomes and share insights to improve practices. We'll move on and look at the phases of the development of the Charter for Fair and Sustainable Funding Practices. Phase 1 is the roundtable consultation. For this phase, we propose that the Federal Nonprofit Advocate convenes a roundtable with a mandate to develop a charter for fair and sustainable funding practices. This will discuss the key priority areas for nonprofits, including their funding capacity challenges in providing decent work to their employees. The second phase is the feedback consolidation phase. Following the roundtable, the federal nonprofit advocates will lead the feedback consolidation process and draft a charter as well as a public discussion document for input. The third phase is public consultation. Over a 90-day period, key stakeholders and the broader public will provide feedback on the draft charter. The federal nonprofit advocates will then incorporate these inputs and finalize the charter. The last phase is the final draft of the charter. Once the charter is finalized, the federal nonprofit advocates would publish publicly this charter as well as share the report with all departments of the federal government involved in grants and funding contributions to implement the principles we have proposed into their work. We anticipate that the adoption of these principles will take a phased approach in order to shore up the capacity of nonprofits over time. And based on the cost of similar roundtable consultation process, we estimate that this roundtable consultation process will cost between $350,000 and $500,000. As these guidelines are implemented in governmental grants and funding contributions, we envisage fair and sustainable funding to nonprofits. This will improve their services as well as increase their capacity to provide decent work to their employees, which includes newcomer groups. To sum up, Imagine Canada posed a question to us. First, what are the key factors driving newcomers to Canada to seek employment in the nonprofit sector? In our presentation, we have discussed barriers to the labor market and have shown the opportunities in nonprofits that pulls newcomers in. The second part of the question, how can the nonprofit sector best support the integration of newcomers to Canada? Part of the answer is by providing decent work to newcomers. We have highlighted the unique role of nonprofits as both employers and organizations that deliver services to newcomers. With this, we have suggested 2 recommendations. 1, a program that directly strengthens the capacity of nonprofits to provide decent work, and 2, a more systemic approach to tackle the core funding issue in the sector. Newcomers immigrate to Canada from all over the world for the opportunities this country has to offer. They go through a rigorous process where only a selection of the most experienced, the most skilled, and the most educated are given the opportunity to fill an essential gap in the labor market. However, once they arrive, they're not given the necessary support systems in order to thrive. The gap newcomers fill in the country is integral to the Canadian economy, as we have discussed in our presentation. Their integration yields benefits not only to them and to their families, but tremendous benefits to the Canadian economy. The nonprofit sector has proven to facilitate this integration process of newcomers, and it is time to strengthen the capacity of the nonprofit sector to ensure this. Thank you.
Thank you, team. Okay, to the judges. Who's up?
Thank you very much. And everybody's pretty excited. I think we're getting close to drinking. I think is no. That was all enthusiasm for your presentation. Just kidding. Can I just one quick piece before I ask my question? And I may have missed it in your materials, and I just don't know. Does the federal internship program not provide support for nonprofits, or does it?
Thank you for your question. So the way it supports the nonprofit is by actually giving them with extra labor, right? With extra people working for the nonprofit,
Right.
And it's a way to support the nonprofit and to build their capacity.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question is it has two pieces. Sorry, Natalie. One is, it sounds like did you look at just the possibility of doing a significant expansion of the internship program if it's already there, and if it's working, a significant expansion of that to the nonprofit sector? But the other half of this is not all nonprofits are created alike, and some are really effective and some are not so effective. And did you look at that part of the discussion of how to capitalize on the ones that are effective as opposed to ones that are not?
Yeah, sorry, you were referring to the FIN program, right? The FIN program is a program that is delivered by IRCC, and this program is basically an internship to provide work experience to newcomers, and it's only for 90 days. So, and it's a way that they can work in the government. It's with the federal, provincial, or municipal governments. So it doesn't, it's not related to the nonprofit sector. So that's why we propose a different program. Yeah.
And then the second part of it, did you look at, did you do any kind of analysis of which of the nonprofits, which of the CBOs should be focused on as being effective or not? Because otherwise it sounds like, it sounds like you're just saying give more money to all the CBOs.
Yeah, so we have, as a precedent, we have the Canada Summer Jobs program. They provide a wage subsidy to private and nonprofit organizations that are small, that are 50 employees or less. So basically, we're using the same parameter to bring that to the program that we are proposing. And basically, we're saying that we want the 100% wage subsidy to nonprofits, because that's what the Canada Summer Jobs, they do. Because in that way, it's a way that they recognize that the nonprofit sector has these funding issues, and it is a way in which the government provides some of this help to the nonprofit sector. And they don't do the same with the private sector, because this program only gives 50% to private organizations, but to the nonprofits, it's 100% of the wage subsidy.
Just to add to Sarah's comment, the nonprofit sector contributes 8.3% of GDP. And then we, in our charter, we have a guideline that says the focus should be on CBOs that are most vulnerable. So these are CBOs that are in rural communities, because they get less funding compared to those in urban areas. So we have specific criteria on the type of CBOs to look at and why they should be looked at. One of the criteria is to look at CBOs in rural communities, and most importantly, SPOs, the service provider organizations. They are also small groups, but they take the lead in providing settlement services, language training, employment-related services, among others. But then overall, yes, there are CBOs that are not effective, but then generally, most community-based organizations are not effective for the same reason we are proposing. They do not have enough funding capacity, and that is what we want to fix.
Thanks for the presentation. I do a lot of work, as probably everybody here does, with not-for-profit organizations and community-serving organizations. So I definitely know of what you speak and where your heart is coming from. That said, I do wonder why you chose to focus on recommendation number 2. So the specific question was, how do we attach newcomers to the field? The second, and usually when we work on these kinds of complex problems, it's because we end up in trouble because we try and boil the ocean instead of getting it down to something manageable. You started with something manageable and then decided, I think, to boil the ocean. And I'm just a bit, so that seems to me like an odd thing to do. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And specifically, the recommendation for a charter. There's kind of a theme of what we've seen over the last few days, which is everything is the federal government doing things for everybody. And in some cases, that's unavoidable. But in this case, most money comes for nonprofit organizations, if we're talking about community servicing organizations, not universities and hospitals and all the other stuff in that category, comes from donors in the provincial government, and really a small amount comes from the federal government. I was just reading an article in The Philanthropist on this morning, which I shouldn't have been doing it at 4 o'clock in the morning, but it's what you read when it's 4 a.m. But so that kind of leads me to, I can understand why Imagine Canada or a project like this might want to work with the federal government because it's one point of contact and it's manageable, and otherwise the sector's all over the place. But this has to be one of the examples where it really, really is only going to work if the charter is going to go anywhere. It's going to happen at the provincial level. Everything, as I just said, everything we've done over the last few days, that's an element, but I think this is one of those cases where it's very, very clear. So how did you decide that this recommendation number 2 was something you wanted to focus your precious time on?
Thank you for your question and your comments. A lot to unpack there. So first, primarily with the parameters of the policy lab, one of the requirements is to make it implementable for our sponsor. And from our understanding with our engagements with our sponsor, correct me, I know they're in the room, is that they do their engagement mostly at the federal level. So that's why it was scoped at the federal level. And because the federal government's hands are a bit tied due to the prominent federalism question that we've been going through today, the federal government is responsible for immigration, and while the provincial government is responsible for integration services that relate to newcomers. So there isn't much that the federal government can do from the integration side of things, which would provide direct support for newcomers. What they can do, however, is to create a sort of backstop on the type of funding principles that should be implemented for government funding. And the federal government here can lead by example by implementing these funding principles within the federal government funding structure. And the development as well of the charter involves a consultation with the federal government, with provincial government partners, with employers, with labor unions, with nonprofits. It's a whole of government approach in that way as well, to be able to tap into all the different actors that are involved who have a stake in integration of newcomers and the labor market integration in particular. So I hope that answers your question. And I think the only other piece I would add is the advocate role as well, to create in-home person in the government who the nonprofit sector can turn to bring their complaints and to highlight the funding challenges that they have, because right now nonprofits are already, of course, engaging with the federal government and other government partners. The problem is that to do it in a piecemeal way makes it a bit difficult to get their advocacy off the ground. So the idea of the federal advocate as part of the charter is to get whole of government approach and to get whole of society advocacy on this issue. That helps.
Sorry, if I can just add to, I heard a first question in your full question, but why we chose more, like you say, to boil the ocean with the second recommendation. And really it came after we discussed the first program and kind of set it up together, is that an unintended consequence of a program like this is that when funding is pulled, that the job might cease to exist because the nonprofit can't sustain it because of the lack of funds. And through all of the stakeholders we met and a lot of the rich literature that we read, sustainable funding is a very, very key issue. And that's why we wanted to kind of create, although a more systemic and more long-term and maybe more difficult recommendation in the long run, it seemed to us like it would be the correct thing to address the core of the issue, which is the sustainability of funding practices and the challenges that brings to a lot of nonprofits across the board.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one last comment to that question. So when we're brainstorming through this recommendation, yes, the nonprofit sector is in need of more funding, but the main issue here is not about the quantum, it's mainly about how the funding is given. Is it flexible or is it restricted? That has a lot to do with the effectiveness of the sector. So what we want to do with this charter is to legislate a law that would regulate funding for it to be more flexible for the sector. Because even when you give millions and millions to the nonprofit sector and you ask them to spend only 2% or 5% on operational costs, they wouldn't be able to have the operational capacity because they cannot hire, they cannot retain talent. So the most chunk of the money is really unflexible. So that is what we really want to change. So at the heart of this issue is providing unconditional funding. But then we are not trading it off for accountability. We are saying that it should be streamlined, the processes should be easy, and then the administrative procedures should be more relaxed. Yes.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. I guess the question refers to integration, which for me has a connotation of graduating in some sense, and the sense that people, may go to the newcomers may go into the nonprofit sector, but ultimately the objective here is to have them enter the mainstream of the Canadian workforce. And some of them who have particular skills or talents that are suited to the kind of work they do in the nonprofit may remain there, but many or most of them should be finding jobs in elsewhere in the Canadian economy. And your report identifies a number of reasons that they don't do that immediately on arrival in Canada, that they're facing various barriers. So I guess that really has basically the two parts to my question, which is, how do you accomplish that? But the two parts are, how do you, how much have you thought about how the nonprofits can work to actually help put the newcomers that they hire in a better position to overcome those obstacles after they've been with the nonprofit for a year or two, so that then they can leave and somebody else can take that opportunity. Some other newcomer can benefit from the same kind of experience. And then, of course, the other aspect of that is that you don't want it to be the case that people get too comfortable working in a nonprofit and they don't have any incentive to move, because in that case they remove the opportunity for somebody else to benefit from what they benefited from. So, interested in your thoughts on the extent to which you've looked at those aspects. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So the concept of integration is something we also grappled with a lot very early on in the process when we saw the question. And the research and even some scholars we spoke to at McGill University in the sociology department, many people who are like experts in migration studies even contest the topic of integration as a whole. We want, like IRCC talks about integration as a two-way street between a newcomer and the Canadian society and economy. And there are many different ways of understanding a very complex and very subjective issue as well. And what do we really want when we want a newcomer to feel integrated into society? That's something that is subjective as well. And that's why we placed, when we were scoping this, defined it as, at a very basic level, as at least the unrestricted access to the labor market, be it the nonprofit or the broader labor market. That's one. And two, one thing we were very careful about throughout our research and scoping this report and trying to answer the question is that we didn't really want to remove agency from the newcomer. And turnover is something that is normal and common and actually beneficial to an economy and the labor market overall. So that's why one of the NNP program has an intentional minimum 1 year, maximum 2 year limit to the job, because then the newcomer can move on to either another nonprofit or, as their choice see fits, to the broader labor market where they want to be. And the idea is that they would have, at least that barrier of Canadian work experience would have been resolved. So, yeah.
Thank you again. I would add my voice to this question. I think we also considered that, and in our deliberations and in developing this recommendation, I'll speak to the skill development aspect of it from newcomers when they arrive into Canada. And so we took a look, as we mentioned, at the Canada Summer Jobs as well as the FAME program. And the duration of that is short to the extent that some of the stakeholders we spoke to said by the time the interns come in, by the time they get accustomed to the role or the work they are in, the time will be up and they'll be leaving their job. And so that's what informed our intentionality in making it medium to long-term role between 1 and 2 years, so that they will gain the Canadian work experience as well as polish their English skills or French skills. And one feature of our NNP program, which we developed further in our report, is the mentorship feature. And we intentionally put that in our recommendation because once newcomers are in touch with a Canadian or somebody who is knowledgeable of the Canadian labor market, one concept we came up with, or one concept we encountered in our research, is social networks and how that is extremely beneficial to newcomers in developing their professional skills. And so an intentional feature we added was the mentorship program, and with this, we hope that newcomers will develop social networks in this NNP program, and it will enhance their skills. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. So we've had a few presentations today, and I know there's a lot of groups asking for a lot of money from the federal government, right? And it's just, I mean, it's unrealistic that all folks are going to get the money that they're asking for. So my question to you is more around, have you found a more cost-effective way to support newcomers coming into Canada, supporting non-for-profits? And I ask because I think when you talk about 100% wage subsidy, when you talk about unconditional funding, as I look forward into like the political reality that we're facing as a country, I think those terms will be non-starters for a different government. So just curious if there's anything you've thought of that can be kind of cost neutral, whether it's foreign credentials. I know that's mentioned in your report. Is there any way you can talk about bringing the cost down and making sure that, you know, it's a lot easier for a government to implement these recommendations?
Thank you for your question. That's definitely a consideration that we had discussed as a group, whether this can be these recommendations can be lasting, what kind of buy-in can be bought over time for newcomer integration. And I think one of the primary considerations that all political parties should consider, whether it's the current Liberals or another party that might be elected soon, I think one of the primary considerations is other economic considerations that are at play here, how much newcomers contribute to the economy, and how much of a leg the failure to integrate newcomers is, whether that's within the nonprofit sector, as this was the scope of our report, but also within the broader labor market itself. If there are so many people coming into Canada, hundreds of thousands of people coming in with the skills, and they come here and are evaluated through this a very rigorous process, but then are unable to actually use these skills and contribute to the economy, I would imagine a government that is very concerned about being cost effective and for providing support for newcomers in terms of their ability to contribute to the economy, I would imagine they'd be quite concerned about the barriers that exist. And this would require certainly collaboration with the nonprofit sector, but also other actors that are involved, whether it's labor unions, professional associations that are involved in the credential recognition process. That sort of was outside of our scope, but that's definitely another consideration too. So I would definitely focus on the impact this has on our economy to garner more political will.
Okay, thank you. We're going to turn it over to sponsors. We've got Emily and Sebastian here from Imagine Canada. So,
thank you, team. It's a great presentation, and certainly the conversation, the questions from the jury reflect a lot of the dynamics that occur on the policy side at our organization, but also in the broader sector. Imagine Canada represents a large swath of the Canadian charitable and nonprofit sector, and we have the privilege and, quite frankly, the luxury of being an organization that has capacity to be able to advocate and call for some of these regulatory changes in the ecosystem. Many organizations, due to the factors that the team has highlighted, just frankly do not even have the capacity to think about those questions at a serious level, let alone put them into practice. So any research into these questions are incredible, have a disproportionate value in the sector. So I just want to thank you for your work in that, and I'm joined by my colleague Emily at Imagine, and we had the pleasure of working with you all. You were a fabulous, very collaborative team, full of questions, and certainly challenged us in the ways we thought about the subject matter as well, right? We've heard today a lot about your two recommendations, and I just wanted to kind of ask perhaps a further question about now Imagine's role in kind of calling for the advancement of those two recommendations. You raised two key ways in which the sector could be supported, one financially and one through the grants program, but one a more regulatory shift. Hypothetically, how can organizations who could benefit from these sorts of supports actually kind of advocate for them and move them forward with the government? given concurrent low capacity in their advocacy. But also, as someone who has met with many, many MPs about some of these questions, I get often raised eyebrows when it comes to the stats relating to the sector, just the lack of knowledge about the GDP impacts of the sector and the fact that 1 in 12 people work, in the nonprofit sector in Canada. We punch way above our weight, but have very little recognition in terms of the kinds of things that we do. What can we in the sector do to put forward a kind of cogent push on something like funding reform?
That's a great question, Sebastian. Thank you. I think what I hear from your question and what first comes to, I think, all of our minds with all of this is the importance of collaboration and partnership. Imagine Canada, like so many other organizations, is an umbrella organization that supports many nonprofits. And like Martha had mentioned, nonprofits are not all alike. And so many might have more capacity than others. And that's why this collaborative and partnering approach is important to get the crucial and necessary needs out on the table and in front of government's eyes. So I think that's one key aspect of it. And second, we think that this federal advocate, or at least getting a direct line between someone in the government and the sector as a whole, is important for that very reason, because then instead of questioning who do I go to, I don't have time to just think about this, discuss this. I'm not sure what mechanisms are available to me as a nonprofit to address many of my issues. At least there's one point of contact that should be, accompanied with an education push or a knowledge awareness campaign. To address many of the issues that you raised.
To drive home Chloe's point, in developing this recommendation, one of the jurisdictions we looked at is Australia, and they in fact have the Australia Charities and Not-for-Profits Commissioner who can be compared to the federal non-profit advocate that we are recommending. And the role of this commission or this body is exactly what you are asking about, Sebastian. And it's an easy access for nonprofits to channel their grievances. It's not just a regulatory body for nonprofits and charities, but it's an access for nonprofits to channel their grievances to a body in government, and that's their challenges can be addressed. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, you hear me. Okay, thank you so much for all of the work that you've put into this project. It's really incredible to see the outputs, and I think that the results would really resonate with organizations across the country. I do think that if you ask most nonprofits what is the biggest barrier to their offering decent work, it would be the way that they are funded. So I think that the funding recommendations that you put forward really make a lot of sense with the realities we see on the ground. I would love to push back on something that one of the judges said, which was about kind of graduating from nonprofit jobs as though they are lesser. Sorry, but I'll gently push back just because, 1 in 12 Canadians do work in the nonprofit sector, and we work on some of the most complex, important social, environmental challenges of our time. And, I'd love to see the sector recognized as an integral part of the sector of the economy versus, the little sister or something like that. But in terms of my question for the team, you just spoken about kind of an economic argument for the first recommendation. I'd love to hear a bit more about what is the key messages or the arguments that you've been thinking about in terms of convincing the government to implement these projects.
Thank you, Emily, for your question. So first of all, I think we thought about the precedent, which is the Canada Summer Jobs. And they actually, I think with that program, that the fact that they provide 100% wage subsidy, it's a way to recognize what the sector is actually facing. And I think that's a way the government is actually recognizing that. So that's why we thought that this program is very feasible. And that's why we were not scared to suggest the 100%, because some people were saying, but why 100%? Why not 50? Why not less? and make the community-based organization put another part of the wage subsidy. We didn't agree with that, and that's why we moved forward with the 100%. And also we've thought that that would marginalize even more other small community-based organizations that wouldn't be able to afford not even 20 or 10% of the wage subsidy. So that's how we saw that this program was very feasible, and that's a way to move forward. And also, I think Teodora explained very clearly all the economic benefits that newcomers would bring if they're actually recognized. And the nonprofit sector is really well positioned to actually get those skills, experiences, and education recognized here in Canada, and then they can move forward. Or if they want to stay in the sector, they're more than welcome to do so. Thank you.
Any other questions? John Stewart.
Hi, I'm going to ask you a question about the scale of community-based organizations. I was chair of two of Ottawa's immigrant services organizations, community-based organizations, one quite small and one was the largest one, and I did that for a long time. Was putting my own resources into the organization and was working really, really hard. It was a really tough job, both of those jobs, but especially the larger organization. It struck me that these organizations were didn't have a lot of scale, even the big one. They weren't integrated over a very large geographical area, and often they had other community-based organizations providing overlapping services with them, so we had to coordinate with them. That exacerbated the problem that Jamil points out, which I reinforce, which was that applying for and complying with government programs was done very inefficiently in our organizations. Often we were only doing it for a couple of employees or a very small amount of money. So it was very inefficient. We didn't have any scale in that, and it was taking time, and often there wasn't any funding for that administrative overhead. So and private donors too, they want their money to go directly to the services. They don't want their money to go to administrative overhead. And that's also true in international development work, by the way. So we had that problem. And finally, because we were small organizations, I found that there was enormous opportunity to strengthen the board and recruit stronger professionals to the board, professionals with wider experience, not just friends of the organization and volunteers who had the time, but really professional board members. And you can do that a lot easier with a bigger organization than with a small one. And increasing the talent on the board, and particularly stronger, more professional chairmanship, could do enormous things to make the organization work better. So, sorry for the long speech, but any thoughts on the scale of these organizations and the opportunity to be realized there?
Thank you very much, John. Yes, the few weeks ago, Statistics Canada published an evaluation of the nonprofit sector, and they segmented the strength of the sector based on the number of people in the board, what type of people are in the board. They also had statistics around the number of employees, and then a gendered analysis of who are those on the board. So I think the scale is definitely very important, and that was why we are emphasizing that the charter should be able to have a guideline that is tailored to each organization, in as much as we want a broad solution to fix the conditional funding, but we also think that it should be tailored. Say again? Yes, so it should be tailored. So the scale is definitely very important, because smaller organizations with 2, 3, 4, 5 employees definitely do not have the capacity. And another issue is that sometimes when the funding comes, there's an evaluation requirement. 60% of organizations do not even use the evaluation document at the end of the evaluation. It's just to check a box for the funder, which is just channeling so much resources away. So definitely there could be a criteria depending on the type of organization, the size, how much people they are spending, whether they are at the provincial level, whether at the municipal level. I think that's very important to be included in the charter and guidelines. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
You'd like a follow-up?
Yeah.
Very quick follow-up.
quick follow-up. I forgot to mention that we had fewer newcomers on the board than on the staffs. We had lots of newcomers on the staffs. That was not a problem. One reason we didn't have more newcomers on the board was that the board was not compensated. And that compensation was not going to happen, especially in the smaller organization, but even in the bigger one. If you compensated the board, more newcomers would be willing to put their time into it, and it would contribute to the professionalization of the board.
Before we let you go, I'd like to ask a question. And it relates to Tim Lane's questions and to Shaq Chambers' question. So I want to pose this in terms of the public interest. So let's suppose we were to agree that it is in the public interest to have immigration. Right? We could have a debate, but let's just agree that that's in the public interest. Let's also suppose that we agree that it is in the public interest that those newcomers to Canada become integrated in not just Canadian society, but let's call it the Canadian labor market. Okay? So your proposals are about devoting public resources to nonprofit organizations to improve the ability of newcomers to be integrated into the labor market. So my question is this: and you're really pushing for an expansion at the margins. This is not a question about the need for a nonprofit sector. It's a question to justify the expansion of the nonprofit sector at the margin. So my question is this: what is special about the nonprofit sector? Try to pretend, by the way, for the answer to this question, that your sponsor isn't Imagine Canada. Try to pretend that these two are not sitting here, okay? But my question is, what is it that is special about the nonprofit sector that is somehow, so that jobs in the nonprofit sector are a better way to integrate newcomers in the labor market than the alternative, which is the Tim Lane alternative, which is the non-nonprofit sector? What's special about the nonprofit sector?
A few weeks ago, I wrote an article on Policy Magazine, and then the issue I was addressing was that those who bear the biggest brunt of the failure of the nonprofit is not the newcomer, it's the vulnerable groups served by the nonprofit sector. Because this is a unique sector that is serving indigenous groups, that is serving the most marginalized groups in Canada. And then, secondly, the government has devolved the responsibility for integrating newcomers to the nonprofit sector. Previously, the government provides direct services, but there has been a movement to the nonprofit sector. When you bring 400,000 people, you obviously have to think of how to integrate them. If you are not doing it yourself and you're allowing a different sector to do it, you must as well fund it. So there are two. Bringing people into Canada is one thing, integrating them is another. So our focus, if you want, you can bring 10,000 if you think you cannot integrate them. But once you bring 400,000 people, you must have a plan. And then the last point I want to end with is that prior to 1995, the funding structure allows for flexible funding. You decide, the nonprofit decide how to, integrate, how to channel the resources. But with the new settlement plan, the government cut some funding, and then there's also improvement in accountability. There's also the challenge. So that led to the issue of all these cuts in expenditure, among others. So that's when the challenge started. So this approach to funding is really an issue. And then it's also it costs the economy $5 billion annually. So I think for these reasons, the government should care.
Answer. Team, thank you very much. Great job.